So this section talks about the skeletal system, which is so important. And I'm actually going to start with the end of this section just because I think it was a little weird that they put this at the end. But the skeletal system is so important. It actually helps support our body, including not just holding us up, but even think about your teeth and that's all held together and in there as part of your skeletal system. It's the springboard for our muscles to make movement from that. It protects us and protects our inner organs. It helps form different blood parts that we need, platelets, blood cells. It's a reservoir where it keeps calcium, phosphorus for us, and like I already said, it helps with our movement because that's what muscles really work with and push off of, including our breathing. So, the skeletal system is very important. You can divide the skeletal system into two halves. The first side that we're going to look at is called the axial skeleton, and this is really like where the most vital skeletal parts are, like your skull, your vertebral column, your ribs. So this is really like what people think about like their center of their body. And then the appendicular skeleton is really all the extra little parts that hang off of us, like shoulders, your arms, your legs, your feet. Okay, so be familiar with those two general sides. The axial skeleton generally helps with more support and protection, and the appendicular skeleton tends to provide support as well, but it is also where the blood forming elements are stored. Um, Inside, you have really two different parts of bones, compact bone and spongy bone. The compact bone is on the outside of the bone and it's very dense. It's found on the outside and it's really important for support. The spongy bone inside is found at the center of the bone, and it's where marrow is making blood elements for us, parts of blood for us. And because the spongy bone needs to distribute the blood elements that it's making, it has these big kind of holes in it that make it look spongy. So these living bone cells are called osteocytes. And there's two basic types of um, bone marrow, or the inner part that we are going to talk about as well. So this inner part cavity. There's red bone marrow and there's yellow bone marrow. So the red bone marrow, it seems a little bit confusing, but it ends up making red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And this type of bone marrow with the red bone marrow that's making red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. It's found in like the arms, the legs, your sternum, which is here. It's found in your vertebrae, and it's found in those types of places. The yellow bone marrow consists of stored fat. And the yellow bone marrow that's just storing fat, it actually can, in an emergency, convert to making the same red blood marrow parts. So I want to talk about here. No, we're going to stick on this picture for a little bit. What makes bone? When you were a tiny little baby growing inside of your mom, you actually started out with a lot of cartilage and not a lot of bone. And you have some cells that form bone called osteoblasts. And when you were this growing little baby inside of your mom, these osteoblasts were working really hard in this bone creation process called ossification. That means making bone. And it's it's like happens while you're growing. Um, Osteoblasts, let me see if I can move on to a new picture. So osteoblasts produce new bone tissue. So like here's a break. And when you first break your bones, you actually have something called osteoclasts. And osteoclasts with a CLASTS at the end, they um, will come in and break down bones so that it can be replaced with new bones. And it's the osteoblasts that really take over and build that new bone when it happens. And you don't just make, I want to point out that you don't just make new bone when you're developing as a baby. Your body is actually doing this process throughout your lifetime. Throughout your lifetime, your body is adding on to bone, remodeling, changing things. If you Your body can even compensate that if you have something that's sideways or incorrect, like for instance, if you got scoliosis or something, and your body has to correct, it can sometimes even build bone on to another place to kind of try to self-correct what is going on. So here are some of the different hinges, or I'm sorry, joints of the skeletal system. So I want to explain these because, especially between these two, I don't think it's my favorite explanation of what these do. So the ball and socket joint really helps you to go in a kind of circular motion, like swinging your arms all the way around or your hips. And some of us are more flexible than me, but can do all those different things. Okay, so a pivot joint, I really want you to think about this as sort of like a twisting motion. It can kind of twist back and forth, whereas a hinge can just go straight back and forth. It doesn't really twist as much. A gliding joint is sort of like the pivot where it can, but it's like the bones can kind of go past each other just a little bit to do really fine movements. So when you're standing on your feet for a long time and you like have to stand straight up, sometimes you'll feel like the little muscles in your feet actually adjusting to hold you up. That's really your gliding joints that are doing that. And then the last one are your sutures, which your bones in your head were not all fused. When you were a baby, some babies that when they first come out, their head's really pointy. That's because as they came out, those bones really flexed as it came through. But then once the baby comes through their mom's like uterus or cervix and comes out, once the baby comes out, the baby's head doesn't now needs protection. It doesn't need to have breaks in it. It needs to not have breaks in it. So it really, the bone starts to fuse in between there, and it's called sutures. This also happens in your jaws. If you have a family that's prone to different joint problems, then they maybe have things like osteoarthritis. This is a really painful arthritis. It's where the little cushions that are in between each joint, it's where those have broken down. So it can be very, very painful. This is not it. This is rheumatoid arthritis. And rheumatoid arthritis is more like wear and tear and doing a lot of overuse of the joints. If you've used the same joints a lot, they can basically get deteriorated. Then there's another one called bursitis. This is like if you have tennis elbow or something like that, where you can actually, you have these fluid filled sacs sometimes between your joints in certain places, and those can become inflamed. And then sprains are actually damage that happens to the ligaments. And remember that ligaments join bone to bone. So when you damage those, that's what's getting bothered with that. Tendons, I want to point that out. Tendons hold muscle to bone, but ligaments will hold bone to bone. So that's important. So that's what you needed to know for this section, and then we will move on.